So good afternoon for most of you. I think this is in theory a European webinar series, but I see a couple of folk here from let me minimize that, from the States here. So welcome. Today's webinar is going to be discover new ABL features in OpenEdge 12.8. 12.8 was released recently, the end of last month. Just about at the end of last month, since we're not in March yet. And yeah, there's been a couple of sessions. I know some of the progress folk have done some sessions, and this is our take on what we think is new and exciting in ABL. There's a lot of stuff in 12.8, not to diminish the rest of it, but hey, I'm a 4GL guy, so I like to focus on that. All right. Going to work, that's not going to work, that's going to work, that's not going to work. Damn slide. There we go. All right, so my name's Peter Judge. I am well, title senior architect at Consulting Work. I've been there for a couple of years. Prior to that, I was at Progress Software for nearly 20 years, and I've been working in 4GL, ABL for longer than that. Most of what I do and what I've done is frameworky integration stuff, libraries, those sort of things. Done a fair bit of work on PASOE as well. And I do enjoy the web side of the world now, more on the back end than the front end. Don't ask me to make a front end, it's not going to be a pretty result. I speak a lot in PUGs, or I like to speak at PUGs. I'm active on various forums. You'll see my names there, and webinars like this, enjoy to do. As I mentioned, I work at Consulting Work. We're an independent IT consulting organization. Our main focus is OpenEdge, really some related technologies as well. And we're kind of almost worldwide at this point. Our headquarters are in Cologne in Germany. I'm based in the US. I'm part of the US branch. We have subsidiaries in the UK, in Romania, and customers almost across the entire world. We primarily provide developer tooling. Feel that gives you a great boost up in modernizing your application, as well as consulting services. And we cover kind of the whole stack. GUI for .NET, Angular front ends, kind of stuff, architecture, modernization, integrations, all of that good stuff. So as mentioned, OpenEdge is the core, maybe the bulk of the work we do, but also other Progress products, things like NativeScript, Corticon, etc., as well as integrations with some of those. We also have other arms or parts of our business relating to front ends, web frameworks, .NET code, and more recently we do a fair bit of DevOps enablement using Jenkins and build scripts, build pipelines, all of those sort of good things. Yeah. If you have questions about any of that, feel free to email me or info@consultingwork.com. All right, so what we'll talk about today, kind of 4 blobs, 4 sections, just touch on a little bit what the kinds of OpenEdge releases are. Then what I'm calling type less code, make fewer mistakes. I should have probably put a question mark on the end of that because, you know, as we know, fewer mistakes is really in the eye of the beholder. Those kind of features, collections, generic connections in particular, and then other bits and pieces. This is going to be probably half slide and demos, and those of you that have seen me speak before know how much luck I have with demos and how well they usually go for me. So you can, you know, sacrifice a chicken or send a prayer to the demo gods, and we will hopefully get through it without too much damage. All right, so on to OpenEdge releases. Progress has got 2 kinds. One, long-term supported releases, LTSs, of which there are now 3. And 12.8 being the most recent one. You can see, can I do a pointer thing here? Pointer option, near the pointer. So released in January of this year. And it's got a retirement date, a sunset date. And the sunset and the retirement means different things for what kind of features get put in, what kind of work kind of updates get made to the release, and retired basically means the end of support. So you can see that these kind of LTSs have got a roughly 3-year cadence, let's just call it that, and they retire as time goes on. So for those of you that are still on 11.7, you can see that the retirement date is coming up next year. That's not that much time left. And so, it's time to move into one of the newer LTSs. Not least of which because of all the cool stuff that's been put into them. But, that release is getting long in the tooth now. In between all of these LTSs, Progress also releases what are called innovation releases. I'm calling them retired innovation here because they have been retired. I'll point you out the way. And so you can see between 12.2 and 12.8, there are 5 product releases with, 4 extra updates. So what's that, 9 releases in total. And the life cycle for these innovation releases is they're active until the next one comes out and then they get retired. So I'm not entirely sure why the 12.5 and 12.4 have got updates on them, .3s and .1s, but you can see for the others that, when 12.6 was released, 12.5 was retired, right? And so the point of these is they are proper releases, but they are retired fairly quickly, within, what is that, Feb to September is 7 months or so, right? So fairly quick turnaround. And they're nice because they bring innovations, all sorts of new and cool stuff, Progress releases, and it gives us a chance to play with that and figure out what's going on and try to improve it over time. Also gives Progress a nice way to phase release a whole bunch of things between LTSs, as we'll see in a sec.
There's one question right now. Is there a given reason why 12.8 is only 6 years an LTS version in comparison with 12.2?
I do not know the answer to that. That would be a question for Progress product management. I don't know. I doubt there's anybody from Progress product management on this call. If there is, feel free to make yourself heard. But that's a question for them. I don't know how those policies are determined. These slides, this one and the next one, as you can see, bottom right link, there's an OpenEdge lifecycle page that I took this information from. So I don't know why that would be the case.
Okay.
Yeah. And on the innovation releases, they are good. We at Consulting Work, we do our development on each innovation release as it comes out. So it's not like they're not good releases. But again, it's just a life cycle thing for the LTSs. All right, so type less code, make fewer mistakes. So there's a bunch of stuff that's been added in that is really, in a sense, syntactic sugar. Or shorthand, starting with the var statement. So I've got a little pointer up here that says the release in which it was released. And I'm going to talk about, I should have said this a sec ago, not just ABL that's released in 12.8, but ABL features that have been released since the last LTS. So we're going to touch on stuff from, as you can see, 12.3 all the way through to 12.8 in terms of ABL that's new. And so, if you're currently on LTS 12.2, this is what you'll all get. If you're on LTS 11.7, you're going to get all of this and a whole lot more. There was a whole bunch of stuff that was added in the 12s or the 12, in the 12 up to 12.2 that you may also get the benefit. You can take the benefit of. So the first cool thing, and this is, is what's called the var statement, and it's effectively, well, shorthand for the defined variable statement. I'm sure most of you, when you first wrote Progress or 4GL or ABL code, and you look at the beginning of a block and you just see this massive wodge of, words to define variables, you're like, oh my goodness, what is this? The var statement simplifies, shortens, improves that drastically. Really, it now looks and feels much nicer, and it's not just syntactic sugar. It doesn't just look nicer. There are some benefits in behavior that we'll get to in a sec. So the var statement looks kind of like this: var, a data type, a name, possibly comma, a second name, comma, a third name, and possibly even initial values. You can see at the bottom, an integer statement, a loop, and a counter. A counter starts at 0. So you can add each one of those as their own. How you structure all of this is obviously going to be up to you. So you can have, var integer I loop on one line, var integer I c and t equals 0 on another line. Also fine. It's just possible to build single lines with multiple definitions in them. In procedures, internal, external, and methods and functions, these var statements must be at the beginning. They must be the first executable code in the block. So that's right after that'll be right after the method or function or procedure statement, right after the block level or using statements in a .p. In class, we'll have a look at one of that. Excuse me. We'll have a look at an example of that in a sec. We'll have a look at that in a sec. But generally, they can be scattered throughout in the class block, not in the methods. Data type names cannot be abbreviated. You can provide an initial value, as I mentioned here. So initial values, names can be abbreviated. This always sticks in my head a little bit. So you can see character, com handle, date time, decimal handle, logical, all of those where you could previously in a defined variable statement say log or long C or whatever, with the exception of char and int. And char and int are synonyms for integer, of character and integer. They're not abbreviations, which sits a little strange with me. I tend to always say var integer rather than var int. So that was in 12.3. Excuse me, added in 12.3. And in 12.4, they improved it. So it works really nicely for arrays, fixed and variable extents. So for instance, here we have a variable extent, C names. You might populate this from, I don't know, the JSON object properties get names method. We can give initial values for fixed extents. So going to be 12. So far in the Gregorian calendar, there's always 12 months. So we can populate those as such. We can also, and this is kind of where it gets cool, where it becomes more than just kind of syntactic sugar. So we have an indeterminate array, right? So that's no fixed extent with a name, and we're giving it 7 initial values. And what the AVM is doing under the covers here is saying, okay, hang on, it's basically doing 3 statements. It's doing define variable C weekdays as character extent period. It's doing extent C weekdays is 7, and then it's saying assign C weekdays 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to these values. So really saving you typing those 3 lines of code. Setting this initial value this way doesn't mean it loses its indeterminate status, if you will. So if you wanted to change the extent of that weekdays variable, you could go ahead and do that, and that would be fine and follow the normal array rules. That's really nifty. And in 12.4 as well, the best thing in my mind about the var statement is that you can add initial values for things like classes. So that's really nifty. You could always do a variable datetime now, initial now, but now you can do certain functions and things as well. So you could say, data equals something from an input parameter into a method or something like that. You can also just really compress your initialization, if you will, of values. It's not necessarily an initial value, but the initialization of those variable values. So OData might be, new JSON object, and then you can add stuff into it later rather than having those blocks that lie those lines later. You may notice you can also do things like this here, where you can break that statement over 2 lines. Up to you how you structure that. That'll probably be something in your coding standards, how you decide to do that. So yeah, so that's my one of my first favorites in the 12.2 series. Secondly, is what's called the safe navigation operator. So there's a couple of operators here. As your code becomes more and more object-oriented, excuse me, and you can see this if you're working with something like the GUI for .NET controls, the Infodistix controls, even the Microsoft controls, even code that you write, they'll end up having these long chains of references. So you have an object which references another object through a property. That one has another property with another object, etc., etc., etc. And if we want to get a value down, 3 deep into that, parent of a parent, or child of a child of a child, something like that, doing that means we have to do some assumptions like that's always going to be valid. And as I'm sure we all know, we've all been bitten by an assumption failing because somebody didn't know that there was this assumption. So that's typically not a good thing to do. Or you'll end up having a metric ton of these if valid object checks. If valid object, this object, then if valid object of that first child, then if valid object of the second child and the third child, and etc., etc., etc. Or you get used to this message a lot. I think this is in Java. There's this, the null pointer exception is famous for being the thing that just nobody knows exactly where it comes from and what it means. And this, I suppose, is more or less the ABL, the 4GL equivalent of it, right? It's like that could come anywhere. And if you've got a long line of things, it could be anything that's broken. The safe navigation operator basically makes the ABL, the AVM, do those if valid object checks for you. So you can use this question mark colon instead of just using a colon to get a reference to a excuse me, method or a property or an attribute. Excuse me, my throat. It will do those checks for you. And if the checks fail, it just returns the unknown value. So if we take a look down, see, where's my pointer gone? Down here, we have a variable of folder 3, question mark equals parent folder. So that basically says if folder 3 is valid, then look at the value of that property. If that property's value, look at the value of that property. And if that property's value is valid, get that attribute, that property from there. And if any one of those things are false, return the unknown value. We'll see an example of the equivalent of that in a sec. So that is really handy as well for these kinds of cases where you land up with this deep nested set of if valid object then do checks. Then if valid object this and if valid object this colon this and valid object blah 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 blah. Just a lot of noise in code, I believe. Second set of operators are called compound operators. These were added in 12.3. A lot of stuff came quite early. We all have code like this, just a simple iterator, counting stuff or making sure that we loop over things or I equals I plus 1. This is also fairly common, just string concatenation using the substitute statement because we want to make sure we don't have unknown values, those kinds of things. And the compound operators are operators you would have seen in many other languages, basically just chops it down to say plus equals. So takes away the equals I, or the equals I plus, and just says for each I, every time I'm going to add 1. Very handy like that as well. Again, 12.3. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these things in action. And we will come here. No, go away. Hopefully you can read the code that's going to be in here. If you can't, give me a shout and I will increase it. I've just got examples of the var statements here. They are going to be, it's fairly, fairly simple, as I mentioned, and just kind of to show we have the weekdays, we can change the weekdays as we go, right? So just 7 and 8, that's that value, that's that value. You can put a message right before. The foppery, after. This is also behavior that was documented as being part of 12.3. So notice I didn't have to do this to go from a size of 7 to a size of 8. But this behavior is actually available in 12.2. And what's nifty about this is you don't, well, may or may not be nifty. You may not lose some of your values. So if we look here at message, doesn't really matter. I want to do 4. We'll see that Wednesday should still be in there. Right? It just resizes the array. If we make it smaller, it's obviously going to chop off whatever we chop off. So that's nifty for the var statement. In terms of where it is in the class stuff, so I have a class here and make that a bit smaller. So I can put these var statements anywhere in here, right? My reference is returning one here. However, if I wanted to put it into here, if I have, I don't know, right, I have to put it in here. I cannot move this. I cannot move it into. We cannot move it inline. So it'll give us an error message here saying, as I said, must preclude any executable statement where it's allowed. That's good and bad. Generally good. I'm of the school that believe you should group all of your define statements together at the top of a block, so that works well. Where I don't like it is if I want to go and use a variable and just initialize it inside of a block. So it would be nice if I could do that, but that's a minor gripe on my part. Yeah. In our safe assignment operators, let's take a look at, I've got a class here. I'll just open you and you. So I've got not that one, my bad. I've got a folder object here, which is a parent folder, and we can get a child folder out of it. We can do it inline like this. So I can, if I now look, it's a parent-child. So if I want to go and look at these parent-child stack, you can see a whole pile of these. I'm using var statements in most of these things. You can replace them with define variables. You can mix and match define variables. So I could, do I mentioned as folder and do it inline like that. You can mix and match them. So you can, I would, I don't know if I would, so reasons to use the define variable statement are if you want undo variables. All of the vars, all of the variables that are defined using the var statement are defined as no undo, which I think is a really good thing. If you wanted to have undo variables, you would have to define them yourself in this way. You can keep, if you wanted to add things like format to a character variable, you need to use a define variable statement. There's a couple of reasons that you might want to still use the define variable. As I said, if your formatting style is to define the variables as close to where they're used as possible, then you're going to have to use define variable rather than vars, unless you break stuff up into more routine blocks like methods or procedures or things like that. Yeah, format, label. Obviously, if you have a view as phrase, that sort of stuff is not going to be supported for the var statement. I think that's all on the vars. Yeah, so right here, I've got, this folder and I've got this tree structure. And if I message that, I'm just going to comment that out for a sec. When I run these, the messages come down. So we can kind of see, if I run this, grandchild path, child path, path up, and then up 3, there's nothing there. And this is just fairly yuck code. And so using the safe navigation operator, we can, if we wanted to see, you know, if we wanted to just turn this into much cleaner code, you know, upself is, I mean, even this is error prone because if I do this, my code is going to fail already, right? Blanc, our good friend. So make this really bulletproof. We can do that. One, simplify this. We'll just do all the questions all the time. Folder 2, up 1, up 2. Now, obviously, this is a contrived example, but they're of just messaging stuff out and just going up the levels. But you know, you may expect to get this. You may expect to get the top level, you know, statement. So we go there. We can replace all of this code with that. Boom. You know, so just cleans it up a lot. Sometimes you need to go and do checks explicitly on each one, but in certain cases, you may have a particular structure that you're working with and just want to check that there's got a child of a child. I see a couple of questions have floated in. Just to go to the do, the question is do considered a block in which the var can be used? It is not. They're routine level blocks, so that's going to be a procedure, internal procedure, function, method, class. Not a do block, not a for each, not a repeat, unfortunately. It's just in the bigger blocks, if you want to think of them that way. The safe navigation operator only works on object references, does not work on handles, on widget-based objects, or whatever the terminology is, does not work on handles, unfortunately. So for the handles, you're still going to have if valid handle X, then do this, then do this, then do this, or if valid handle, etc. I mean, I suppose you could make an argument that there's a cheat in all of this stuff, which is just to assign it to a variable, no error, and then you're potentially going to get an unknown value, but it's not really useful either. So yeah. So right now we have this on a property, right? On the object itself, we have it on a property. This folder, parent folder property here is a folder of type folder, or property of type folder, and we can also work this. This will also work on methods. So we've got two methods here, and I'll just make that a bit bigger. And whoops, we get an error because missing is missing. So we can also say if, you know, again, just to do it exhaustively, depends how much faith you have in that value. Now we can say that works on the method outcome. One thing to be aware of, if you wanted to do this on something like, I'm using the Visual Studio Code extension, and it doesn't quite support the var statement nicely for doing things like code completion in this case. So in this case, if I wanted to say message, I don't know, JO get JSON object property, right? You can see there's no property there. We haven't put anything in there. This is going to give us an error right now. And in theory, not even JO, right? If we looked at with names, do it that way. No, that's not going to work. We get a child. something like that. This is going to fail because the errors on that are the getter, effectively, the method is going to fail on that. Right, property was not found, and that's just inside of the JSON object. So you have to, there may be cases, I guess the point is that the implementation of that method may return an error like this rather than just returning an unknown value. So the safe navigation operator does not protect you from that. You still have to do other error handling for those kind of conditions. All right, safe navigation operators, also very cool. And the last one here, just to have a brief look at, is the compound assignments. And again, this should be fairly intuitive to you how these all work. You can, they work for addition, they work for subtraction, multiplication, division. That's division. This looks funky here because I have ligatures turned on in my font, and it does that with /equals. So whatever we've got there, A to Z, those kind of concatenations, and then our numbers. Easy peasy. Again, works in conjunction with, you don't have to change any code, right? I equals I plus 1 is still going to work. D equals D divided by 2 is still going to work, all hunky-dory. And Progress always does a good job of that, making sure that existing stuff carries on working without when these new features are released. Cool. All righty. So we will go back to our slides. Okay. So the next thing we're going to look at are generic collections, and do just a quick recap of what they are, and then just talk about what is available. And this is, as you'll see, one of the kind of iteration over features thing that comes out of these innovation releases. There were 3 releases worth of collections added in OpenEdge from 12.5, 12.6, and 12.7, kind of added on as it goes, just to extend the functionality and improve it. So collections, what are they? Buckets of stuff. You define what the stuff is. They are like temp tables, but they're better in a couple of ways. Mainly because they're passed around by reference, because they are objects. Different collections have different types of constraints or rules. So these are fairly common names. A list is as a collection of indexed items. A set is a collection of unique items. And depending on your kind of language, a map or a dictionary is a set of name-value pairs. Dictionary is what the .NET world calls it. Largely, map is Java, and various other languages call them maps, but you'll see them kind of used interchangeably. Behaviors are defined by interfaces typically. I'm using the .NET convention here. I list, I map, I set, whatever, and they can have different implementations, right? So you work against the interface, but the implementation can vary for various reasons. Usually the intent, the stuff you store in a collection, is a single ABL type. So something like a string, or in our case, table model, or a data access class. Could be a variety of things, right? Could be a UI component, it could be whatever. Collections are extremely useful tools in an OO world. So prior to 12.5, if you wanted to use collections, you had to write them yourself. And you tended to go one of 2 ways. So if you wanted to stick to an interface-based approach, where you had kind of one I list, then you tended to use ProgressLang object as the type, and then you had some form of type checking at runtime. So if you wanted to put data access objects into a collection, you had to accept everything and then have a assert statement, or if not type of kind of statement. And it makes it very unclear what types are in the collection from the definition. And even at runtime, it makes it very hard from the definition, and there's no compiler help. So, you tend to find errors at runtime rather than at compile time. You could also go the other way, where you have specifically typed things for each type of collection. So you if you have a collection of data access objects, then you've got a class called list data access or something like that, list string, whatever it might be. What you gain there is the strong typing. What you lose there is the ability to use one interface for all the collections. And so that's what generic types give you and generics give you. So basically you can say, define a class, define a program once, and say it's always going to do the same operations on this type. So you can add, in a collection, you can add things of a type. I don't know what the type is right now, but you can add it, and we can add behavior on there. But what the generic types give you over something like progress lagging object as a type is that the compiler will start to enforce making sure that you put only those specific types, classes of those types into that collection. So you're not pretty much guaranteed. You are guaranteed that if you've got a list of strings types, there are only going to be string types in there, and the compiler can help you with that, and it helps you with making some of your code a little cleaner. Removes a bunch of cast statements potentially. Excuse me. So this functionality was started being added into the AVM or the ABL in 12.5. There's a progress collections namespace. The API looks a lot like the C# one as opposed to the Java one, which are slightly different. And just as a note, ABL has supported .NET generic types because they're used in a bunch of GUI for .NET components since 10.2a. And you'll often see those in ABL codes, kind of define variable as, and then double quotes, I don't know, component angle bracket. The syntax looks pretty much everywhere like this: angle bracket and a type name, class name. And I say type name, but that could be an interface name, it could be a class name, doesn't really matter. So just in terms of that, so T is a generic parameter syntax. T is just T for type. The value of that letter doesn't actually matter at all. It's just shorthand. It just says there's a T coming. The arguments are provided at runtime, or by the consumer's code, the developer's code. So we have a var statement here of a list. So we use the list I list. We're saying everything that goes in here must be of I country type. So that could be whatever. A name of the variable, and we're initializing it. So however we do the initialization, we can do this in a defined variable statement as well. As I said, I'm just using var throughout this presentation. And we create a new one, and we say I list, new list. So that's the implementation, no interface. That's the interface for it. And it also takes I country. And you have to pass the same value in here and here. And that's the way that was done. Other languages let you ignore the angle here because it's going to put it in anyway, but Progress or OpenEdge requires that. When you call properties on that now, but now you can pass in other things. So that's our country list. I'm going to add a new object. I mean, I'm newing them as they go in. They could get added in various ways. And European country and African country both implement the iCountry interface. So they are legally allowed to be put in here. I can add unknown values into the list as well, which is also kind of handy, or maybe handy. So onto lists specifically, as I mentioned, they were added in 12.5, and the definition of a list is an ordered collection of objects. So think of it, you'll often see references to array list as an implementation of a list, kind of the same thing, right? You add it in, if you add them, it'll add in the first position, second position, third, blah, 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 until you stop. There are no special requirements for objects to be added to a list, as long as it meets the is a requirement. So is the object you're adding in, is it a type of whatever the collection was defined as? And as I said, we can add unknown objects in there as well. That's 12.5, that's cool. And those are really handy. In our smart component library, we use lists pervasively for very, very many things. They're not very big lists necessarily. They may not have more than 10 items in them. but we use them pervasively. And I should mention, and I don't mention it on this slide, I don't know why, the one huge advantage of using the built-in lists, or another one, right? There's the generic nature of it, but the lists and generally all of the collections are super fast, super performant. Super performant in terms of how they work in terms of memory usage. Many other kind of hand-built options will either use arrays or common delimited strings, something delimited strings, or temp tables, all of which have their own costs. The lists, the collections added into the Progress Collections namespace are really fast. Progress has done a bunch of kind of work demonstrating that. If you go take a look at some of their sprint reviews, or some of the presentations they've done, and we saw the same. So in fact, in our list collections, what we've done is we've pulled the guts of them out because we don't want to impact our consumers, our existing code. But for backwards compatibility, we keep that API, as it were. But on the inside, we use lists for this, and we get a noticeable performance improvement from that. So that's another good reason to use the built-in collections. Excuse me. Sets were added in 12.6, and a set is a collection of unique objects. Everybody's a special snowflake. I'll come back to what makes a thing unique in a sec, because that's kind of important. The initial implementation, and so a set doesn't care about, a set at an interface level doesn't care about any implementation, right? It just cares that it has unique objects. The initial implementation from Progress was a sorted set, Progress Collections sorted set. So as you might guess, that adds a second thing onto the set, right? Uniqueness and ordering. So if you add things in there, you would expect them to be sorted in a sane order. The level of sanity may depend on the implementation, but it will be a consistent, I should rather say, than a sane order. And so in a sorted set, when objects are added, they get compared to each other. I believe the implementation underneath all of this stuff is some form of B tree. But when you add objects into the set, they get compared to each other and to see, are they unique, right? And what is their order? And this is done using an object called a comparer. And I'm going to over enunciate these things because the words are so similar. So a comparer. And a comparer says, given two objects of any type, or of type T, actually not of any type, of type T, so string, or I don't know, we looked at a folder earlier, or whatever we looked at, person. I know how to compare these two things. I know how to determine whether they're the same thing, like AKA, is it a duplicate, and where they are ranked in an order. Okay. Progress provides a default comparer in the set. So when you instantiate a sorted set, it says, aha, I know I have a comparer I'm going to use. And this default comparer has a requirement to that the objects in a set must implement a comparable T interface. So it must be able to say, I am comparable to, so I am comparable to this type. So if you have an, for instance, we'll go into that, let's say, two types of employees, right? Let's say you've got employees and you've got managers. We break them into those two pieces. And they are both of type, they both implement the I-employee interface. You should be able to compare a manager with a line employee or a non-manager or a non-manager. And so the manager class must implement the comparable I employee, and so must the line employee implement that interface so we can compare the two. So that's using the default comparer But as you'll see in a sec, we can write our own comparers to do things that we think are useful. So there may be more complexity. We may do whatever. We may want alternatives to those comparers. Excuse me. So that's a set, unique objects, and sorted sets mean that they are sorted in a particular order. The last collection added in 12.7 was a map dictionary, and it's a collection of key value pairs. So the keys are unique. So there's a couple of ways of looking at that. You could think of it as a set where key is this type, key value pair KV. So you'll notice here that these inside of the angle brackets there's a K comma V. As I said, the T means nothing. This is just a convention. T is for type, K is for key, V is for value. It doesn't matter, but that's a fairly standard convention that you can do. Yeah, so maps are also very, very useful things. Again, sets of key value pairs, property names, I don't know, a variety of uses for maps. You know, anything where there's a name value set, you're gonna use these. The default the initial implementation from Progress is what's called a hash map. So hash map KV. And as I said, the keys are unique, and in the hash map, the key value is determined by a hash code. And there's a new hash code function in the ABL provided to let you provide that. So in all of these things, certainly in the sets and in the maps or the keys, Progress doesn't make any assumptions. OpenEdge makes no assumptions on what makes a thing unique and how a thing has to sort. Right? It requires you in your application, in your framework, to be able to say, hey, these things are equal because of X, whatever X is in the application. These things sort this way because of that reason. So that has to be provided by the application because Progress cannot know this stuff. It's just impossible to know. They don't know what types you have. They don't know what's special about those types. On the value side, there's no requirement there, right? You can have unknown values. You can have any object put in there. The key is the important thing. All right, just seeing the questions. There's a question around, is there a list empty method like .NET? Not that I know of. That could be a useful thing to add an idea for. Yeah. All right, let's go look at collections. All right. So I'm going to add a new demo.p in here. All right, and so we're going to work with we each going to have a procedure. I do have a we've got a country interface. We've got an African country because that's where I'm from originally. Oops, not an O. And we've got a European country. Right, so they both implement this iCountry interface, which has a country code on it. African country has nothing special on it. European country has as a flag, a property saying, is it in the Eurozone? Both of them have a override on the toString, which just shows you kind of what type it is, EU and the country code, or AF and the country code. All right. So defining our collection, let's do this star, and we're going to have a list of countries. List. Right, so now we have an empty list, and we can do things like add records into it or add items in, not records, items into it. We can check the count, etc. So if we're going to take a look at our country list. and it's going to be 0, right? It's empty. We've got, but we can now go and add stuff in here. So we can add Africa. We can add just Germany, an African country, and it's in the euro. And we can add, I don't know, Denmark, because I know it's not in the euro. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so now we've added stuff, and we can keep adding this. I'm adding new instances every time. I don't have to do that. I could define a variable and add them, and then add them that way. Right, so we have 3 items in here now. Okay, so that's useful. Now we want to do something with them. And yeah, as I also mentioned, we can add a, in between those two, right? We're going to have 4 in here now because we can add unknown values. It's happy with that. And that's basically because it's indexed, if you will, on this count. So we've got 4 in here. If we want to go get these items out, we can get let's get number 3 out, whatever it is, right? And when we run that, it shows me that it got number 3 out. The message statement is quite a powerful statement. It's one of the fun things. It will automatically call toString on that object that it gets returned back. You can do 1, so that's not 1, that's 3. I line like a cheap watch. 3, let's do 2. And that's going to return us 2 and 3. So we can get items out by number. We don't always know what the number is, to be honest. And we can get stuff out with what's called, well, we can loop through it, right? So we could say, so we could do that. We can loop through them. And get the values out. If I use the right variable name, that is. And somewhere we've got a catch. We've got an error in here. How does this one? Country list get loop.
You haven't said I count.
I haven't said I count. Thank you. Thank you. I haven't saved it. Do that. All right. So okay. So we can work with this way as well. Generally, collections have what are called iterators, which is an object way of iterating over collection. Not all collections have order, right? A set is not guaranteed to have order. The implementation says it has order. Maps, what's the order of a map, right? Lists have order by definition, but they're pretty much the only ones. So we can iterator or country. We can iterate over this differently. So we get the country list and we get iterator and well, iterator And now we can message our the object. Iterator. All right. So a couple of things that are really good here, and again show the benefit of the or maybe illustrate it this way, of the generic collections, is this assignment over here, right? This is defined as iCountry, right? I don't have to do any casting. I don't have to do any type checking because the iterator is defined as being of a country. The list is defined as being of a country. The AVM takes care of all of that type conversion for you. So it cleans up your code quite substantially. And we can work through it that way. All right. Let's take a look at sets quickly. So I can write a similar looking code, right? I have a country set of a type country. I'm adding stuff in here. In theory, this should all work very nicely. I'll just do this, my life a little easier. And if we now run this, it gives us an error because our country is not comparable. So I've added a person. I'll just change. So I've got persons here that I've added in. And a person, I've said, has got first name and last name, as you would expect. It's got a comparable, it implements a comparable interface, which is this blob of code here. And this basically says first name, last name, determine uniqueness, and we are going to sort this by last name, first name. I'm just going to, yeah, so we're going to add, we're calling add 4 times, right? 4 persons. You'll notice here, this one and this one are the same. Because it's a unique collection, we should only see 3 items in there. Okay. So doing that, working on an iterator, right? And so the iterator on the set is just going to sort through the order of the set. So this is going to be sorted by last name, first name in theory. If we run that, we have 3, right? Because our comparer method or said those 2 are the same, right? It knows 2 persons are the same, and it sorted them by last name, Adams, Jones, Thompson. Cool, cool. As I mentioned, we can also do our own comparer, right? So this is all very similar code, and our person comparer says, I want to sort it by first name, last name. So this is slightly different. This is not a person itself. It just knows how to compare person objects. So it gets 2 of them and says this to that, this to that, this to that. Whereas the comparable has one parameter, which is compare what I get to me. That's the important difference. When we do a person comparer here, right? If we run this now with our comparer, it's going to sort it by first name. So Ansel, Roger, Zadie, not by Adams, Thompson. Those are out of order, out of the previous order. And we can also do fun things like this and say we don't actually want it to use the default, default comparer. We'll just take that out. And our custom code will continue to work, but the default code should fail. You should fail. I am failing. In theory, this should fail because the person is no longer comparable. I have no idea why it stopped being comparable. That's why, because it crashed. All right, that's not very helpful. So sets. Lastly, on the, I think that was it. Lastly, on the map side, we have a map, again, just pre-made code, a map of employees and their locations, right? So we have an employee, which is a person with a code. We have a country that we've seen before. And so we have 4 employees, different codes, and we can add them into the map, and we can get the value of, let's say, Anders Anderson out, right? So EUDK, that's over here. The European country, as I said, there's a value, it has nothing special in it. What is special is the
This conference will now be recorded.
Somebody is, thank you, not muted. But the employee needs to be able to be found as a unique value, and that now implements this hashable interface. And the hashable interface requires us to have a hash code method. The hash code method can use the hash code ABL function, and we've decided that the employee ID is the thing that makes this employee unique. Doesn't matter about anything else. It's really just the hash code, the employee ID, that makes them unique. And so with that, we can now add employees in as long as they have unique names. We try to add a different person in, they would get with the same code. We don't care about the names. We could add, if we try to do something like this, and we try to get our friend Sam O'British out, it would not return Denmark, right? Unknown value because, of course they are, because of we didn't put the value in. So we've determined that we've got this in the map already, and we're not going to add a new one. One of the things we can look at here, one of the important things here, because the values are allowed to be unknown, if we try and get a value for whatever missing person with a code of 999, we are going to get, you can see at the bottom here, the unknown value for that country code, right? That person is not in here. If we did that for, this for Sam, we would get the same value, right? So how do we know whether Sam is in the, or whether that's the result of Sam being in the map or not? And so there's a method. There's a method for that. So we can use what is called the let's change that to that, try get value. That basically says if Sam is in there, then we will return the value. And so we could see that for missing person as well. So missing person is, both have values, but missing person is there. So there's a bunch of things around there that make working with the maps and the collections very powerful. The last thing I just wanted to show on maps very quickly was they also have iterators, right? So the iterators look a little little gnarly, maybe. So we have a map defined of employee and country. We have an iterator on that map of that key value pair. And that itself is a generic type. So you can end up getting these angle brackets all over the show. If we work through that, we can look at the key, we can look at the value, right? Because those are properties of that current, of that, where'd it go, key value pair object. We could also iterate over the set of keys in the, in the map, right? So if we want just to look at the key values, we can do that with, where'd it go? We can get the keys property, which is itself a collection, and iterate and get an iterator of that and iterate over that. So if we just run that, just make that a bit bigger, we can see our first thing, we're looking at keys and values, keys and values. If we only want to look at the keys, we can just iterate over that collection. Depends on what your use cases are for how you want to get the values out. Generally, generally you're going to, with maps, get records out individually, or often you're going to do it that way. Okay, so collections. How am I doing on time? But
short question. Do we know what hashing algorithm is used? Robinhood, Google's hashing algorithm, something else?
I have no idea. Progress has not made that knowledge public. I don't know if there's a reason to not make it public. I suspect it's one of the, there's no, it's not important to know. It's not pertinent. But I don't know. You could ask Progress Tech Support. They might be able to give you an answer. Could ask on Progress Communities. They might be able to give you an answer there as well. Somebody might give you an answer there, but I don't know what the hashing algorithm is.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, so the last couple of bits and bobs, and in the interests of being not too late, because I'm already late, I apologize. A couple of things. So in 12.8, Progress introduced the ability to do dynamic import and export. So the equivalent of the import and export statements. So in the past, if you wanted to have one piece of code to dump various tables, you had to do one of two things. Either write a lot of dynamic programming, so get the buffer handle, get the number of fields on there. So, for basically dynamic query on a table, then loop through all of the fields in the table manually, find out what the data type is, find out what the dump format is, do the comma delimited thing, or do the quotes if you had to, or whatever. All of this blah, 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 blah code, lots and lots and lots of code. Or you could do what the data dictionary uses, and it does that because it was written in a very long time, V7, right? It would have been written in V7. Uses runtime arguments, which is the reason why you need a compiler license to be able to do a dictionary dump and load. And it uses compile arguments. In 12.8, you can do something like the below. Easy peasy lemon squeezy, right? Buffer export. There's a buffer export fields. There's a couple of variations on this. So you can buffer export, you can provide field lists if you want to, no lobs, all of that sort of stuff that's available, delimiters that's available on the import and export statements. And similarly, you can do a buffer import. So you would, read through a file, a flat file, read the data in, and have a nice day. So that's really, really useful. Also a thing I think people have been asking for a long time. The one change in the AVM that came in 12.4 that you should know about is that prior to 12.4, if there was an error raised in a where clause, so for instance here I'm doing an integer on a character field, if that value was ABC rather than 1, 3, 4 or something, and this function failed and returned an error, prior to 12.4, Progress would just say, okay, well, we're just going to say that's equivalent to where order line.line_num equals the unknown value. and that without throwing any errors. So it's kind of silent failure, and then whatever happened, happened. So if you had line nums with question mark in them, with an unknown value in them, then great, you would see some data. If you didn't, then you wouldn't see data. In 12.4, an exception is thrown, and the query does not execute at all, and you have to catch and deal with that error outside of that for each block. Right? You can't catch it in the for each block because the for each doesn't actually execute. So that's just important to know, because I've seen some subtle behavior changes caused by this, where queries aren't returning what they previously were. So this is more of a thing to know and watch for. It may mean you have to add more error handling into your application code. And you can also revert the behavior with this -z no query errors starter parameter. The fact that it starts with a Z tends to indicate that that's not, Z is for secret. It's not, shouldn't be used longer term. So yeah, so you can revert that while you fix your code is the intent of that. I'm not going to show a demo on that stuff, just in the interest of time. Another question, output to stream, mem pointer. I assume the question is for the dynamic export, can I export to a stream? The answer to a stream is yes. The answer to a mem pointer or a long char is no. The buffer export and buffer import methods match the export and import statement functionality pretty much one-to-one. Yeah, so 12.8 is the latest LTS. Again, five releases, 4 extra updates over 4 years. There's a ton of ABL in there. Like I touched on some. One of the other huge things that's in the in 12.8, in 12.6 and 12.8, I believe, is the ability to use .NET Core, so that the .NET Bridge is improved to be able to use .NET Core. It's not only on Windows, but also on Linux. I didn't talk about that at all. There'll be another, I'll show you in a sec, but there'll be another presentation on .NET Core in OpenEdge coming. Lots of ABL, lots of PASV improvements, lots of database improvements, a whole bunch of other stuff over time, or over those 4 years. And again, if you're looking to move from 12.7, I touched on it earlier, like from our side, we would really recommend going to 12.8. 12.2 has got a few more years left in it, but moving from 12.7 to 12.8, sorry, 11.7, not 12.7, 12.7 to 12.8, obviously, but 11.7 to 12.8, we would highly recommend you do that. There's a couple of webinars in the series. I just mentioned .NET Core in April. Keep an eye out for that on our website, and a few others, building ABL clients based on Swagger, modernization, code refactoring, etc. Also, we'll be at the Pug Challenge in Europe, in September in Prague, in the Czech Republic, as well as the America's Pug Challenge sometime in September or October. All right, and then that'll come with questions. So there's a couple of
2 more.
Okay, I will take a look at those. So question is, any thoughts on leveraging using 12.8 syntax while still needing to support 12.2? Yeah, therein lies the rub, doesn't it? So lots of code bases are, define variable, and you may want to move to var statement. That, again, there are various ways of doing that, I suppose. An option, and I'm shrugging because I don't think it's a good option necessarily, is to fork your code base. It just means you have to move your functional stuff across. Another option might be to use preprocessors, which you could then remove once your customer base has moved on to 12.8, say. And so, your defined variables go into one preprocessor statement that assumes you have a common include or something like that, that you can use to do that. to be honest, one of the reasons we haven't really adopted some of this new syntax, some of the functionality, as I said, we have, like the lists, but kind of the var statement it is tricky being able to maintain that. The code looks very, very different in a way. So those are options. Certainly functional things. So and just on the other ones, on the compound assignment or compound operators, they're even trickier because they're kind of scattered throughout your code, right? It's not depending on your code style where variables are at the top of a block. You've got all of these I equals I plus ones or whatever it might be throughout your code base, and wrapping those in preprocessors just makes the code harder to read, I would think, than easier. So for some of this stuff, it might be a wait until the majority of your code base is moved, or the majority of your customer base has moved on to a more modern version. I don't think there's a good answer. I don't know if anybody else has any experience with that. Is there anything to chime in on that topic? There was another question on aggregations. Yes, the aggregate statement was added in, are you asking me when? 12.4, I'm going to say maybe 12.5, which is effectively a faster way of counting records in a table, in a database table. I decided not to cover it in here for reasons of time, but it is a way of speeding up counting of records in the table. Again, a really good place to look for what's new in, just go find it here, new window. The progress documentation site, you can read that on the 12.8. In what's new in 12.8, it rolls up. You can see all of the roll-ups of the various releases. So that's a handy way of seeing what's new in what version. And this piece of the documentation is improved over the last few years. So it actually is useful to see what is new. So I think it was 12.5. Was it here? 12.5, encryption, productivity, data server. No, it would have been 12.4 then, I think. var statements, this kind of stuff, you can link from here for the aggregate, for the aggregation on here. Yeah, again, it's a good place of learning what is new, what is improved. I know for looking for in the older versions of OpenEdge, it was really hard to figure out what changed where. At least now there's kind of a compiled version of that. There's another comment or question, whether anyone has built map-reduced functionality on generics yet.
Oh my God, is there already?
I don't know. I know I certainly haven't, or we certainly haven't. I don't know if anybody's built map-reduced functionality in progress to begin with, but that's a different story. That's an interesting question. Alrighty. So question is, do we know how the index selection works on aggregates? Does it work the same? I don't know for a fact. I would assume it would work the same, and I would assume that because breaking indexes and code that searches indexes is going to have a massive knock-on effect. It's going to be a really risky thing to do, I think, in the AVM. So either you'll end up with two separate styles of searching the indexes, or just one. And having two, there's danger. Does it show up in XREFs? I don't know. Does the aggregate statement show up in XREF? If that's the question, I don't know if there's an equivalent to a search. We can have a very quick look here. It might tell us. Actually, wouldn't tell us here, would it? It would tell us.
Yeah, but we are slowly running out of time.
We are very running out of time. Yeah. So
we'll remove slowly. So all the questions you still have please forward that towards Peter. I believe your email address was also mentioned there.
It might have been.
And
if it wasn't there. That was silly. You know, nothing like Notepad to help with that. Pretend like it was there all along. So if you have other questions, if you want to follow up with me, by all means, please do. Yeah, and don't forget to show up for, or please come for, I think the .NET Core one will be really interesting. That's more ABL improvements in the 12.8 LTS, and yeah, look forward to seeing everybody there. Yeah, and so thank you for coming. Thank you for your time.